Welcome, everyone, to the captive audience. It is the 6th of January, and here we are. Uh, uh, it is 2026. This is the first live show of 2026, and I sure am glad to be with you here tonight. A lot of news happened, and you know what? Least important of these is the holy observance of January 6th by Democrats, which they consider to be the greatest crisis of all time. Turns out, of course, as we know in retrospect, that we really did end up getting duped by all of the stuff that took place on January 6th. I did a show, I remember doing a show on January 6th, condemning the people who actually did cause violence and riot. It was a very small number of people, but I also remember seeing something that I observed that day. Specifically, I remember observing uh, that people were being invited or allowed in by the Capitol Police onto the grounds, and I thought, wait a second here, why did that happen? Like, what kind of security is that? Well, it turns out we've learned so much since then. We learned from Nancy Pelosi herself that they, in fact, um, screwed up, as she put it. Now, I don't know if it's a screw up because when you get so many warnings in advance that help you know that something's going to happen, and you get an offer from President Trump of 10,000 National Guard troops, which, as we know now, he has no hesitation of deploying if it's necessary in order to make sure that the safety and security of the United States are needed. Any city in the city, but particularly Washington, D.C. And you know who said no to it? Nancy Pelosi. So, and she admitted it, but didn't come out for a couple of years until an HBO documentary made this clear that, in fact, that was the case. So here we are, years later, finally getting to the truth. Now, we also know, in hindsight, that there was a deployment of dozens of undercover FBI agents and Homeland Security agents in the crowd, and at least one of them later identified to be such a uh, operative, I should say, as opposed to agent. Apparently, there were some operatives. They um, there was one that was identified as such that was encouraging people to go into the Capitol and break things. And of course, we know lots of people who had nothing to do with any violence, um, and found themselves just walking into the Capitol building because they were allowed in, even encouraged to go in uh, by the Capitol Police, who were under orders. And to this day, we have no idea who issued those orders and what those orders consisted of, but they were under orders to just let it happen. Anyway, so here we are on January 6 years later, and only now are we beginning to uncover what really happened that day. Now, if people committed actual crimes, destroyed property, many of them actually were arrested and prosecuted. However, egregiously so, in a sense that uh, something that we saw done endlessly during the year 2020 in the so-called summer of love across the country, in fact, didn't merit the same kind of treatment by the Department of Justice. In fact, many of those folks with Antifa and other groups, Black Lives Matter, that rioted and destroyed things and caused tens of millions of dollars in damage across the country, billions actually, in fact, um, they but almost none of them faced any kind of prosecution whatsoever for what they did. We know that former Vice President Kamala Harris helped uh, get bail for people so that they would be released from jail um, in order to, after having committed some of these crimes in Minnesota. And there's a state that's a piece of work. So, anyway, let's conclude that there's one last piece of January 6th news. We have talked about it here. They have found and charged the individual who for years, the Biden administration and law enforcement said they had no idea who it was. It's the pipe bomber, the one who put down pipe bombs next to the RNC and the DNC. Fortunately, he didn't fit the narrative of what the Biden administration wanted to say was happening on January 6th. And that, of course, was that he was black, which is, not a good reason to fail to prosecute somebody. But for the Biden administration, the super woke Biden administration, it just didn't fit with what they were trying to say, nor did it fit with what the congressional panel that was put together, that wasn't a duly constituted committee, who distorted evidence. The January 6th committee, populated by a couple of phony Republicans who are now out of office, and rightly so, and Democrats who destroyed evidence that they did not want to get into the hands of House Republicans 2 years later when they lost power. And so we're still in the shadow of January 6th. But you know what? There's other things that are now seeming to take precedence on this whole anniversary of the Democrats. And that is that we saw what a real president does. And we also saw what a real failure looks like in Minnesota. So let me start with Minnesota, and then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about Maduro and President Trump and what was done there. Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, who was the 2024 vice presidential nominee for the Democrat Party, running mate to Kamala Harris, the loser in 2024, I'm happy to say. He has been facing unbelievable amount of criticism that has ramped up dramatically after the billions that appear to have been stolen from and defrauded from the federal treasury and paid to people who are about 90% of which, in terms of arrests so far, are in the Somali community in Minnesota. And there's the famous instance of the daycare center, the Leering Center, that was discovered by the podcaster who went in and just asked, "Can I enroll my son here?" And they're like, "No, go away." And turns out they couldn't even spell the word learning, but they got money for this. And it's an entire scam. And yet it's so large that it's defied any belief that this could have not involved, or at least been done with the awareness to some degree, or people looking the other way in the state government in Minnesota, which administrated this. So, we really had, this is what was exploding in Somalia, in Minnesota. And it got so bad that Tim Walz has decided to call off his reelection run for governor in Minnesota. I can tell you that somebody who was recently the Democrat nominee for vice president, only months later, or a year later, finding himself having to end his political career, means that this is pretty serious. Now, he's sort of lashing out now and screaming at people and getting angry because, he had to go ahead and dump his own political career. But having said that, it shows how serious it is, because those guys never quit. They never give up on their their political opportunities. They pretty much wait out any controversy and figure that they're too far above it, too holier than thou to be held accountable. He says he will not resign. He said over his dead body, but politically, I think that is the case, and otherwise he would have never stopped his reelection run. And there's continuing concerns that the fraud in Minnesota will be perpetuated by the people running the state of Minnesota, which are all Democrats. So, wow, that's a big deal. That's big news. That's just happened in the last 48 hours. let's go to the real big news over the weekend, which is the capture um, by U.S. military forces of Nicolas Maduro, who is the illegitimate ex-president of Venezuela, who was continuing to control Venezuela and was also the leader of what is, in fact, um, a narco terrorist organization. And he has been brought up on charges in accordance with this. He was captured by Delta forces, brought out to a ship, then transported back to New York City, and yesterday was brought up officially indicted on charges in Manhattan, charges that were an indictment that was filed uh, over 5 years earlier, I think almost 6 years earlier, in Manhattan under the previous Trump administration and the previous Attorney General Bill Barr. So, this is um, this is an extraordinary military slash law enforcement operation. What's been more surprising than what took place, which frankly was an extraordinary feat militarily and operationally, but also something that Venezuelans in Venezuela and all over the world are celebrating. The biggest surprise, really, in some ways, is that the Democrat leadership are desperately trying to um, figure out how to gain traction in calling it illegal, unconstitutional, claiming the president's lying, claiming he's just doing it to get oil. But it was a very targeted operation. Now has created an opportunity for 28 million Venezuelans to maybe have a new chance at a government that represents them and to restore the economy and the freedom they once had decades ago when Hugo Chavez took over and then later was replaced by Nicolas Maduro. This is a country with the largest uh, amount of identified oil reserves in the world, and yet they produce 30% of the oil they did in 1999. So, and all of the ability to do this is atrophied over the years. Their biggest client became China. And of course, China was doing all kinds of things to work with this government and, frankly, subvert many other governments in the Western Hemisphere. And Nicolas Maduro's guards, a bunch of whom were actually killed in this raid, were Cubans, the ones that were actually guarding him because he didn't trust Venezuelans to protect him. And, I do think that uh, as we've seen the Democrats come out with one explanation after another, everything is falling apart for them in terms of their response to this. They claimed it was illegal, and yet there's a profoundly clear legal precedent. That legal precedent is what happened in 1989 and 1990 with Manuel Noriega, the former and now deceased dictator of Panama. He was removed. It was after he was indicted in the United States, and that involved 27,000 military troops going into the Panama Canal Zone, surrounding him and removing him, and then taking him back. And he was prosecuted in Florida. He challenged his prosecution, saying he had sovereign immunity as a foreign head of state, and that was adjudicated in the U.S. courts. It went through the 11th Circuit Court, and they ruled against him and said, nope, being a foreign leader of any kind does not shield you from U.S. courts and justice. And his challenge of sovereign immunity was knocked down, and the U.S. Supreme Court chose to leave the 11th Circuit Court ruling standing and did not challenge it. So everything the Democrats said about being illegal completely negated by court precedent from a nearly identical circumstance. In fact, there's more evidence and more egregious charges against Nicolas Maduro than there was against Manuel Noriega. So that's one thing to know. The next thing to know is that they're saying it's all about oil. Well, the United States is an oil superpower. We produce close to the greatest amount of oil in the world. We're constantly sort of in competition for the largest producer between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Russia can't sell their oil anywhere without offering a steep discount, but they sell it to China. Interesting. However, by the way, they were involved in this Venezuela thing. But, the people who want Venezuelan oil to be sold now, it's not the United States. I mean, we have oil. And though we'd offer a significant market for the Venezuelans, there is no doubt that the people who need the Venezuelan oil to be provided to the world market and sold are the Venezuelans, who now have an economy where people literally have been starving. They couldn't buy toilet paper, basic necessities, and this used to be one of the wealthiest countries in the Western Hemisphere, if not the world, if you go back 30 years. 8 million people have fled Venezuela over the last decade, and I think 3 million of them have settled in the United States. That is the second largest refugee crisis in the world after Syria, which, as we know, flooded Europe with millions and millions of Syrian refugees, and Turkey as well, flooded Turkey. Well, President Trump ends problems and solves things. And here's what happened with this one. Now there's a new chance at a new government. We're not going to allow Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, any of them to have anything to do with it. And this new government is going to have to start working. It's going to have to attain legitimacy and work on behalf of the Venezuelan people. And we're going to help them get this oil back on the market so they can rebuild their country. Not so we can rebuild their country, so they can rebuild their country, which is a huge distinction from what happened in the Middle East with the nation building exercise that took place in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, getting Venezuela back in the hands of the Venezuelans is a top priority here. But we're not going to miss the opportunity to make sure that this is done right and that they don't become another basket case or a client state exploited by enemies outside the Western Hemisphere. So President Trump has given teeth to the Monroe Doctrine. Democrats, meanwhile, are flailing about saying, well, what's his plan? What's he going to do? And yet they're all saying that no one's going to lose sleep over the fact that Nicolas Maduro has been removed and is no longer running Venezuela. They said that he's an awful person. Well, if he's such an awful person, then are you saying he should be sent back? I mean, these charges sat in the books throughout the Biden administration. They could have dropped it, said, nope, we're going to be friends with this guy and let him stay. They just did nothing about it. So the President Trump did something about it. And American troops, American armed forces skillfully took care of this matter and the FBI actually did the arrest on the ground and took him back to Venezuela. He will probably serve as much or more time than Manuel Noriega did, which is Manuel Noriega was sentenced to 40 years, served 30. Died in prison in Panama himself, actually. So there are millions of people celebrating from the Venezuelan community around the world. Then why aren't the Democrats celebrating? And it's because whatever President Trump does, they're going to oppose. Whatever Trump says he's trying to do, they're going to claim that he has some kind of ill motivation. And yet, when asked what their option or their plan was, they didn't have one. In fact, several Oregon Republicans argued in favor of that sovereignty is the most important principle that exists in international affairs and law. Well, actually, we already know that the US judicial system has adjudicated this, and that is not the case at all here. The Democrats are trying to call it an act of war. It wasn't an act of war when they removed Manuel Noriega, and the court system upheld that point of view. Also, uh, ordering the U.S. military to do something on short timelines, brief timelines, where it's taken care of quickly and concluded and it's successful, uh, doesn't abridge even the War Powers Act, whose constitutionality has not been really tested, but it doesn't abridge the War Powers Act. You'd actually have to have a military action that would continue and beyond 90 days. So, again, Democrats had a problem with uh, destroying the Iran nuclear program. Well, they screwed around for years and let it turn into a problem in the first place. So this is really a big deal. And there are people saying, well, we should stay out of foreign entanglements and we should avoid endless wars. This one's not endless. This one's done. We should stay out of foreign entanglements. This is right here in our hemisphere. It resulted in 3 million people coming to our country, including, by the way, I might add, and this is part of the stuff that they've gone after Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro for, is during his tenure, he used the fact that President Biden opened the southern border and let anybody in who wanted to, including criminals. Trende Aragua is the criminal gang, the narco-terrorist criminal gang that sent people into our country and started building a criminal empire here and victimizing people in the United States. Well, Trende Aragua was started in a Venezuelan jail, and what they did is they emptied the Venezuelan jails and sent them to the United States. And then he actually started working through these groups. So this is what the indictments say. This is what the reports, widely disseminated reports, and yet you still have Senator Chris Coons from Delaware coming out and claiming, well, this just isn't legitimate. He called it a kidnapping. So, this is why when you have Democrats in charge, all these things go wrong. You get all these wars, you get all these failures to resolve problems, and you get endless wars from Democrats ultimately because they don't end them. They just turn them into something that serves their political purposes. President Trump fixes problems and ends the wars. This one's basically over, folks. We're going to see how the new government settles in. We're going to see how that gets sorted out. But you know what? One less problem for the United States and the world. And frankly, 28 million Venezuelans and maybe more from that diaspora of 8 million are now going to enjoy a positive future. Kamala Harris said that we had to solve the root problems in Central and South America to stop the flow of illegal immigrants into the United States. Well, President Trump showed that you can actually close the border and you don't need to solve the root problems. But why are they complaining about solving the root problem that was causing Venezuelans to flee Venezuela? They should be celebrating. So this is where we're at now. And there's so much more to this. There's many other layers to this onion. And I got to say, the fact that people consider this a political opportunity when they should be celebrating with the Venezuelans that this has finally been resolved and is going to go on the right track. I just think, I'm not giving Democrats political advice. I keep hoping that they just do more stupid stuff, but this is really dumb. And them claiming that they're going to invoke the War Powers Resolution, that they're going to probably put it on the list of things they'd like to impeach President Trump for if they get control of Congress. Well, I think millions and millions of Venezuelans should speak up, both in Venezuela and the ones here. It's time to hold people accountable who did nothing and play politics with your future. Also, I think there's an opportunity to show that there is a way to take limited actions when necessary in order to alleviate the problems that are created for the United States by these countries. And by the way, I haven't said one word yet about one of the key words, which is the illegal drugs. The illegal drugs that were being smuggled in on speedboats, not on fishing boats, uh, and penetrating into the United States and then operating through criminal networks in the United States. That was an attack on the United States by a foreign adversary. And we have every right to put a stop to that. So I think this is like across the board a success, which makes many of the Democrats even more angry about this. Lastly, I just want to kind of wrap up today's show. Thanking you for watching us here. Thank you for your patience when we can't do live shows. But I did want to mention that somebody I've always admired and frankly thought he would have made a wonderful leader in his own right was Ronald Reagan's eldest son, Michael Reagan. He passed away today at the age of 80. I love that guy. And he was a principled guy, and he was probably the only Reagan that was really a conservative after his son, after his father. He was adopted, but Ron Reagan Jr. isn't exactly the spitting image of his father in terms of politics, but Michael Reagan was. And so for those of us who remember history and know who he was, I just wanted to say, rest in peace, Michael Reagan. Thank you for trumpeting your father's legacy and for your love of country. And, you know, I hope you've got an opportunity now to rejoin your father on the other side of the pearly gates. Thank you. Anyway, so I think we're going to see more about January 6th in the future, but maybe this January 6th, we're turning a page from the absurdities and the nonsense and getting back to running the country and exercising our power within the world in a way that produces peace through strength, that produces public safety, that ends the scourges that are, in some cases, sponsored by hostile powers to undermine the United States and its people. And frankly, to get back to a prosperous future of freedom and liberty, which also today we should pray for and wish for the people of Venezuela, who I think have every reason to celebrate. Anyway, thanks for watching tonight. For some reason, the comments in the stream didn't work, so I'm sorry if you've been commenting and asking questions, but I do appreciate your viewing tonight, and I want to thank you. Please share the show with everyone you can, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Captive Audience. Happy 2020.